Live in Las Vegas tour to set, and I didn't do that because I don't have one. I was joking, but I think she thought it was serious. I was a huge...
This entire ordeal is stretched on so endlessly that I can feel deja vu creeping in, like the same storm is replaying itself over and over, looping without mercy, as though time itself has become stuck in a cruel cycle where the drama refuses to die down and instead feeds off its own chaos, growing louder, heavier, and more suffocating with every passing week. Hello, my darlings. It's me, Perez, the queen of all media, the original influencer before influencers even had a name, the journalist who never sleeps, the podcaster whose voice refuses to be silenced, the diva who thrives on drama, the icon who sets the tone and your ultimate, unshakable one-stop source for every shocking twist, every sudden turn, and every fire eruption in the relentless it ends with a saga that refuses to burn out, and instead rises again and again like a phoenix. With scorched wings, only this phoenix brings nothing but ash, lawsuits, and broken reputations in its wake. And let me tell you, this week the saga hasn't cooled. No, it is boiled hotter than ever, angrier, sharper, and louder, spilling over like a pot long left unattended, hissing and spitting, refusing to simmer down no matter how many times people try to cover with a lid. You know where I stand on Busted Blake's bestie, Judge Lyman, whose name alone seems to mock justice itself, a name that begs for a rhyme drenched in disdain. Erupt, abrupt, corrupt, bankrupt, take your pick. Because every single move from that bench in New York lands like a hammer striking the same bruised target over and over again. Justin Baldoni and the Wayfarer defendants, who have found themselves chained to a cycle of rulings that never lean in their favor, rulings that arrive like waves. During a storm, relentless and unmerciful, blow after blow, loss after loss, ruling after ruling. It's an unbroken streak of defeats, a bleak cascade that feels more like an avalanche, swallowing them whole with no lifeline, no rope, no hand stretched out to pull them free, leaving them gasping in the cold shadow of a system that seems determined to grind them down to dust. Yeah, it tracks. It makes sense when you lay it out like that. But the lingering question that gnaws at me is, why did it have to turn into such a devastating blow? Why such a merciless response when, in truth, all they were asking for was a 1-week extension, a measly 7 days, the kind of grace period that in almost any other context would pass without comment, barely worth a raised eyebrow, let alone a scathing denial. They didn't march into court with arrogance or with gamesmanship. They went in with a straightforward explanation, one that sounded practical, almost boring in its technicality. They said the delay wasn't their fault, that it wasn't born of bad faith, but rather tangled logistics and the kind of technological mess anyone could stumble into when dealing with encrypted communications, third-party vendors, and complicated extraction processes that always look easier on paper than they turn out to be in practice. They made it clear that the vendor tasked with collecting the signal messages had run into unanticipated difficulties, that the process wasn't moving smoothly, and that coupled with the unavoidable chaos of travel schedules, business obligations, and human realities of juggling so many moving parts at once, the timeline had slipped out of reach. And to me, that sounded perfectly reasonable. If anything, it sounded like the kind of mundane hiccup that happens in every major case. After all, we're not talking about some vast delays stretching for months. We're talking about a handful of days, just enough to catch their breath and push through the bottleneck. The names tied to the requested extension weren't insignificant either. Melissa Nathan, Steve Sorowitz, Brian Friedman, and Summer Benson. Real people whose communications were tied directly to the heartbeat of the case. People who had actually used Signal, not peripheral figures, but custodians of information the court wanted. And Summer wasn't just any name on that list. She was a lawyer, which made the whole thing even more delicate, layered with questions of privilege, confidentiality, and heightened stakes. When you put it all together, it read like a request born of necessity, not manipulation, a plea for reason in a system that supposedly values fairness. And yet, despite how ordinary, how sensible, how inevitable it all seemed, the judge wasn't swayed in the slightest. He wasn't here for excuses, wasn't here for nuance, and certainly wasn't here to entertain the notion that technology, travel, and human fallibility could derail a rigid schedule. Instead, he saw an opening to enforce the letter of the law with a cold finality that stripped away any room for compassion. But life is messy and mistakes happen, SH happens, as we say, but Judge Lyman was not hearing any of it. Not the excuses, not the explanations, not the context. His written order landed like a cold slap. He said, with brutal clarity, that the Wayfarer parties filed their motion only on the evening of the very day compliance was due, with no effort to meet and confer with opposing counsel beforehand, no courtesy call, no gesture of good faith, no explanation for why they hadn't acted sooner. To him, it looked like a last-second scramble, a Hail Mary tossed too late. He hammered further. If the court's order had been entered back on August 27, 2025, there was nothing stopping them from filing earlier, nothing that prevented them from seeking relief in advance. And in his eyes, they had offered no good cause for the delay. He wrote it plainly, like a teacher scrawling red ink across an exam. No good cause. Now that's debatable. You could argue they had a reason. You could point to the tangled knot of technology, the stubbornness of encrypted data, the unpredictability of third-party vendors. But Lyman wasn't entertaining debate. He traced the history, the paper trail, the breadcrumbs of delay. The signal chats had first been requested back in February 20th, 2025. To be exact, that was months ago. And when the defendants dragged their feet, the plaintiff had reiterated the request on July 16th, demanding production within 30 days, a deadline that would have landed on August 16th. Yet here we were, creeping toward mid-September, and still no signal messages delivered. Now, I pride myself on being team truth. And the truth is, when they mess up, it matters to say it out loud. Yes, they should have handed this material over long ago if they'd simply cooperated instead of getting tangled in the weeds. But I also understand the other side. Lawsuits are wars, and wars are contentious. Every scrap of information fought over like territory. Still, the record is a record, and Judge Lyman had the receipts. He reminded everyone that on August 11th, the Wayfarer camp had filed a submission stating, clearly and unequivocally, that they intended to produce the signal communications. They had every intention of meeting the demand. But when the time came, technical chaos struck. Phones had to be surrendered to the vendor for 12 to 24 hours at a time. Travel schedules complicated the handoff. Unanticipated technological failures bogged down the process. It was messy, inconvenient, frustrating. But to Lyman, all of that was noise. He dismissed it as insufficient. His reasoning was simple, almost mechanical. The Wayfarer parties had been on notice since February. By July at the latest, they knew exactly what was expected. They had agreed a month earlier to produce the messages. That timeline, he argued, gave them more than enough runway to get their act together. So when the deadline blew past, he wasn't buying claims of unforeseeable chaos. To him, it looked like negligence, or worse, deliberate foot-dragging.
We have to learn how to love those parts of ourselves so that then we can appreciate them in the opposite sex.
His ruling was final, blunt, and merciless, a command that landed with the weight of verdict, echoing through the courtroom and far beyond its walls. There was no hesitation in Judge Louis J. Lyman's tone, no sympathy woven into the words, no acknowledgement of the desperate plea that had been laid before him. He spoke with the sharpness of a blade, cutting clean to the arguments and excuses, and with a single directive he stripped away the defendant's last shred of hope for leniency. The clerk of court was ordered to close the motion for the 1-week extension, docket number 746. Filed, stamped, sealed, and locked forever into the archives of futility. So ordered, Louis J. Lyman. Those words sat on the page like gravestones, stark and immovable, markers of an opportunity lost. The gavel may not have fallen with dramatic crack, but the finality was the same. A door slammed shut, a chapter abruptly ended. And yet, when the ink dried, when the courtroom air settled into its oppressive stillness, the question that followed was louder than any gavel strike. What now? The defendants had missed their deadline, pleaded for mercy, and mercy was denied with the cold efficiency of a surgeon's cut. Now they stood exposed, stripped of excuses, staring down a road that branched into punishments, each one more perilous than the last. It was not merely about paperwork anymore. It was about survival. Judge Lyman had in his arsenal the formidable weapon of Rule 37, and he knew how to wield it. That rule was not a technicality buried in the fine print. It was a sword forged for moments exactly like this, when parties defied discovery orders and thumbed their noses at the machinery of justice. Rule 37 empowered him to punish, and punishment under its banner was never gentle. Fines could be imposed, not symbolic slaps on the wrist, but devastating blows calibrated to hurt. They would not be arbitrary numbers. They would be carefully chosen to sting, to cut into accounts already stretched thin, to remind the Wayfair defendants that defiance carried a price in hard currency. Worse, he could shift costs entirely, ordering them to pay their opponents soaring legal fees, transforming every billable hour logged against them into another dagger twisting in their side. The burden would grow unbearable, each invoice a reminder that their own misstep was feeding the enemy's arsenal. But financial pain was only the beginning. The penalties could escalate into consequences that gnawed at the very structure of their defense. The judge could strip away crucial evidence, tearing entire planks on the platform they had hoped to stand on at trial. Imagine carefully prepared exhibits, expert testimony, or documents painstakingly gathered, gone in an instant, dismissed as though they never existed, leaving their case hollow and weakened. He could go further still, shackling their attorneys by limiting the defenses they were even allowed to raise. Arguments once considered essential could be silenced before they reached the ears of a single juror, leaving the defense stumbling with half its weapons taken away. And then came the darkest possibility, the punishment that loomed like an executioner's axe. Jury instructions designed to assume the worst about the missing material. A judge's words to a jury carried the weight of law itself, and if Lyman chose to tell the panel that the absence of data should be seen as evidence of guilt, negligence, or deception, the case would be crippled beyond repair. It would not just tilt the scales of justice, it would send them crashing down with crushing force, leaving the defendants buried beneath. Each of these options hung above their heads like swords suspended by threads that frayed thinner with every passing moment. The longer they delayed, the longer they dodged compliance, the more inevitable the drop became. What began as a simple procedural plea for a modest extension had now transformed into something monstrous, a storm cloud gathering weight in darkness until it threatened to blot out the horizon entirely. Every minute that passed was a reminder that the mercy they had hoped for was gone, replaced by the looming certainty of retribution. The Wayfair defendants were no longer fighting for convenience or scheduling. They were fighting for survival in a battlefield where the rules were stacked against them and the judge's patience was evaporating fast. The courtroom had become a crucible, and they were inside it. The heat rising, the walls closing in, the silence broken only by the imagined sound of threads snapping, a sword descending, and the sharp edge of justice carving its judgment into their fate. So this will be affecting trial, and not in some small, technical, easy-to-dismiss sort of way, but in a way that can fundamentally alter the shape and trajectory of the entire case, tilting the scales before the first piece of testimony even lands in the record. This isn't the kind of procedural quibble lawyers bury in footnotes or haggle over in pretrial conferences. It's the sort of development that can change the energy in the courtroom, the body language of the attorneys, the confidence of the jurors, and even the tone of the press coverage outside those marble steps. Because if this drags on any longer, Judge Lyman has within his arsenal one of the most punishing, one of the most devastating tools a court can wield. He can tell a jury, not suggest, not hint, but explicitly instruct that they are allowed, even encouraged, to assume the missing evidence. The vanished messages would have been unfavorable to the Wayfair defendants. That alone has the power to reshape everything. It is not a minor sanction. It is not some lawyer's headache or a technical ding in a docket entry. It is, in litigation terms, a nuclear option. And nuclear options leave craters that cannot be filled. Picture the moment. The courtroom hushed, the air tense, the jury seated and waiting for guidance, and then the judge turns his gaze toward them and, in measured words, delivers the instruction. He tells them, in substance, you did not see those chats because the defendants did not produce them, and therefore you may infer that those messages were damaging, unfavorable, even incriminating. That lands like a thunderclap. It is not just a sentence. It is a narrative, a lens through which all subsequent evidence is filtered. And once that lens is in place, the trial itself takes on a different character. The jury carries that thought, that suspicion like a shadow. It lingers in the back of their minds, coloring every testimony they hear, every document they read, every argument they absorb. It sets a tone of distrust before the first witness is sworn in, before the defense gets to introduce itself, before opening statements are finished. That is the cruel power of missing evidence instruction. It doesn't wait until the end to strike. It infects the very beginning. And jurors are not robots. They are people. People carry impressions, and impressions stick. Once a jury believes a defendant has hidden something, the presumption of innocence doesn't just wobble, it collapses. Every denial sounds hollow. Every explanation sounds rehearsed. Every carefully crafted rebuttal feels less like an argument and more like a performance designed to cover up a truth that jurors believe is lurking, unseen, in those missing messages. And even if the defense does everything right from that point on, calls persuasive witnesses, presents clean exhibits, makes brilliant legal points, they are still playing on poisoned ground because suspicion is sticky. Distrust spreads like ink dropped in water, staining the whole trial until no part of it feels untouched. This is not merely about credibility being damaged. This is about credibility being obliterated, credibility being taken out behind the courthouse and executed before the jury's eyes. And once credibility is gone, sympathy goes with it, fairness goes with it, and even the possibility of doubt starts to evaporate. And that's just one front. Because alongside that danger runs a parallel thread of contempt, a separate fuse burning toward its own explosion. Civil contempt may not carry the same cinematic imagery as criminal contempt. No one's going to watch executives in tailored suits hauled out of the courtroom in cuffs or sitting behind bars in a county jail. But that doesn't mean it's painless. In fact, civil contempt can be strategically lethal. A ruling of contempt from Judge Lyman wouldn't simply be about procedure. It would be a declaration. It would be the judge in his official voice saying to the record and to the world, these defendants did not merely stumble or bungle. They willfully disrespected this court. They ignored orders. They thumbed their noses at authority. And that has consequences far beyond fines or sanctions. It is a narrative earthquake. Once contempt is declared, the defense is no longer just battling the evidence or the allegations. They are battling perception that they are arrogant, untrustworthy, and dismissive of the very system meant to hold them accountable. Jurors hear that, and it cuts deep, because contempt is about respect. Respect for the court, respect for the law, respect for the process. When a judge says a party is in contempt, it telegraphs to the jury that the defendants don't respect the rules that everyone else must follow. And when that idea takes root, it doesn't just hurt the defense. It annihilates them. Jurors begin to see every motion, every objection, every argument as another act of defiance, another attempt to bend the rules. Even moments of strength, a sharp cross-examination, a strong witness, can backfire because the jury filters it through the contempt lens. Of course they're slick. Of course they're trying to wriggle out of responsibility. That's what people who defy the rules do. The contempt finding becomes a story the jury tells themselves. And once jurors have a story, they cling to it tighter than any piece of evidence. And all of this plays out in a courtroom where perception matters as much as fact. Judges can order, lawyers can argue, witnesses can testify. But what jurors believe, what they feel, is what ultimately decides the fate of a case. That's why these developments, missing evidence instructions, contempt findings matter so much. They don't just add a wrinkle. They change the story. They color the entire canvas. They take a trial that might have been a balanced contest and tip it into a battle fought on uneven ground, with the defendants trudging uphill against suspicion, hostility, and the shadow of judicial disapproval. And in that kind of environment, the odds of a clean victory for the defense grow vanishingly small. And when a federal judge feels disrespected, trust me, the consequences don't just fall gently. They rain down with the force of thunderstorm, relentless, unforgiving, and impossible to escape. What begins as a single fine can snowball into a daily hemorrhage of money, the kind of mounting penalty that feels less like punishment and more like financial suffocation. Each passing day adds weight, until the figures spiral into 6, even 7 digits, bleeding a defense dry before they even step foot in front of jury. Cost-shifting orders twist the knife further, because it's not just about paying your own team anymore. Suddenly, you're writing checks to fund the very lawyers you're fighting against, essentially bankrolling your adversary's war chest. Imagine sitting across the table knowing your dollars are fueling their strategy sessions, paying for their depositions, underwriting the evidence that will one day be used to bury you. And then there are sanctions, those surgical strikes of judicial discipline that don't just nick the surface but cut deep into the flesh of credibility and strategy. A judge can impose evidentiary restrictions that hobble your case before it's even argued, or issue scathing written opinions that hang around forever in the legal record, ready to be cited against you in future cases like a scarlet letter branded across your name. But the sharpest thing is that it doesn't stop at the client. Judges don't hesitate to cast their net wider, hauling in the attorneys themselves when they decide the line between mistake and misconduct has been crossed. Suddenly, it's not just your client under scrutiny. It's you, the lawyer, with your reputation on the line. Judges can fine attorneys personally, force them to sit through humiliating contempt hearings, or even refer them to state bar disciplinary committees, but a fallout can linger for years, threatening licenses, careers, and livelihoods. Picture the nightmare of watching your client glare at you for their collapse in defense, while the judge openly questions your competence in a courtroom packed with press. Add to that the collateral damage. Reporters seizing on every scathing word in the judge's ruling, legal blogs dissecting your failure line by line, competitors whispering about your incompetence in hushed but eager tones. And through it all, the unshakable reality is that in federal court, disrespect doesn't just echo. It multiplies, expands, and metastasizes, spreading from a single mistake into a chain reaction of penalties, sanctions, and reputational ruin that can consume not only the case, but the very people trusted to defend it. That tarnishes reputations, rattles an already strained defense team, and broadcasts to the jury, loudly, unmistakably, that this isn't a disciplined, professional operation but a circus of mismanagement teetering on the edge of collapse. Juries pick up on that vibe instantly. They may not know the finer points of civil procedure, but they know chaos when they see it. And they know when one side looks like it's drowning in its own mess. And of course, you can bet that Team Kaka won't let a crack like this go unnoticed. They'll pounce the second the opportunity presents itself, filing their motion to compel with the kind of precision that makes the other side's excuses look flimsy. They won't stop there either. They'll demand sanctions, they'll demand fees, they'll demand consequences that sting, and every line of their file will be sharpened to carry one unmistakable suggestion. Wayfarer isn't just sloppy, they're actively hiding evidence. They'll phrase it diplomatically enough to pass judicial scrutiny, but the subtext will scream louder than the words on the page. Something shady is happening here, and it's intentional. And here's the twist. It won't read like paranoia. It won't sound like conspiracy theory. It will resonate as the most logical, common-sense explanation available. Why? Because these requests didn't materialize overnight. They weren't dropped on the defense like some 11th-hour surprise. They've been sitting on the docket, plain as day, since February. Think about that. Months, literal months, of lead time. Nobody demanded a handover in 24 hours. Nobody set an impossible deadline. All that was asked was preparation. Secure the chats, preserve the records, make sure nothing conveniently disappears. The bare minimum. And yet, what does it look like now? Not diligence, not compliance. It looks like they sat back, watched the clock tick down, and crossed their fingers that the problem would somehow vanish into thin air. But litigation doesn't reward wishful thinking. Hope isn't a strategy. Stalling isn't a shield. Delay, in this context, is dynamite in the other side's hands. It's ammunition packed, primed, and waiting to explode in the form of motions, hearings, and jury instructions that cut deep. And Team Kaka knows exactly how to light that fuse. They'll spin this as a deliberate pattern. A defense trying to duck responsibility by dragging its feet. And the more the record shows delay, the stronger that narrative becomes. Judges hate wasting time. Juries hate being manipulated. And opposing counsel loves nothing more than a paper trail that proves negligence. Add those forces together, and suddenly the smallest act of stalling mushrooms into an existential threat for the entire case. And if we're really going to talk strategy, if we're going to step back and look at the board as a whole, this is where things get truly dangerous to the defense, because the next move on the horizon isn't just another discovery spat, it's summary judgment. That's the phase where the judge doesn't have to wait for a jury to weigh credibility or sift through disputed facts. They can look at the record as it stands, see what's missing, and decide right then and there that certain claims don't survive. It's the procedural equivalent of pulling pieces off the chessboard before the game even reaches checkmate. If the missing chats are deemed essential, If the stonewalling looks deliberate, the defense who watch entire chunks of their case get wiped out with a stroke of a pen. And nothing rattles a legal team or emboldens an opponent quite like a summary judgment order that slices away defenses they thought would carry them to trial. To the uninitiated, summary judgment might sound like a boring procedural step, but it's the silent guillotine of litigation. It means the judge looks at the record and says, "There's nothing to fight about here. One side clearly wins." Normally, judges hesitate, because trials are the crown jewel of the system. But when one party is missing crucial evidence they promised to deliver, suddenly the balance tips. Ridiculous team could stroll in and say, "Your Honor, look at the record. We asked for the chats. They had months. They didn't produce them. What's left is an incomplete defense, a hollow case, an undisputed set of facts that favor us." That argument doesn't just have teeth, it has fangs. And courts have another sharp tool, adverse inference. It lets the judge or jury assume that the missing documents would have been damaging to the party withholding them. So Lively's lawyers can stand up and argue. If those signal chats existed, they would support our claims. The fact that Wayfair refused to turn them over means they're damning. It's a legal way of saying silence speaks volumes. And in the theater of trial, silence can scream louder than any witness. Even if the defendants try to scramble now to produce the chats at the 11th hour, the damage is already done. Judges hate noncompliance. They despise gamesmanship. Every federal judge has a limit. And once they decide a party is being deliberately obstructive, the rope tightens fast. No more extensions. No more patience. Every request looks like a stall tactic. Every excuse sounds like a lie. The defense doesn't just lose credibility with the court. They lose leverage in the case itself. So here's the bottom line. This isn't paperwork hiccup. This is a full-blown crisis moment. Contempt, sanctions, adverse inference, possible summary judgment. All of these are dominoes lined up, waiting for the smallest push. And the Wayfarer team, they're standing right in front of them, praying the wind doesn't